Good evening. Ask any youngster, or any adult for that matter, when did Africans first come to America? And the answer will be in 1619 as indentured servants. Well, that answer is no longer valid, according to Dr. Ivan van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. Dr. van Sertima, an anthropologist and historian, is a graduate of London University and Rutgers Graduate School of Anthropology. He is also a literary critic and has been honored by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy by being asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the past 5 years. Currently, he is professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. van Sertima, up until relatively recently, what had scholars been saying about Africans in the pre-Columbus period in the Americas?
Well, there is a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no appreciation of the fact that after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They've found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1,500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel. Now what has happened to this? If you go back into Tanzania today, you cannot find this. You cannot find that kind of development. Therefore, you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening then. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. African history cannot be recovered, and even American history, early history, cannot be recovered like European history, because Europe has had the advantage after the conquest of having about 5 centuries of fairly settled history. They can go to their libraries, etc., in spite of the wars. But in Africa, the library is in the ground. The record of what has happened, the broken record, lies there. Now they're finding astronomical observatories. 2 years ago, they found that the Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and plotting, the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century. Recently, yesterday in fact, just before I came here, the New York Times brought out a startling article showing that the Africans had entered the domestication of cattle in East Africa 7,000 years before it occurred anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the bases. This is one of the bases of civilization. So that you have to look again at the African. It is because the capacity of the African, the potential of the African, has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives, that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
What is the main idea in your book, They Came Before Columbus?
The main idea in my book is to show that early America, America before the coming of Columbus, was a far more complex society than people imagined, and that it involved Africans. Africans came in here. They came in on several occasions. Sometimes these were accidents, sometimes they were on purpose, and that they had an influence, an actual impact, an influence upon the formation of certain American civilizations.
When we say pre-Columbus period, what are we talking about?
We're talking about long before 1492. It is absurd, and only fools can still believe that Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492. In fact, Columbus never even came to this continent. Columbus wandered about in the Caribbean islands just on the very edge of the great civilization.
Family, this is Dr. Ivan Van Settlement. He's one of our great scholars. He was dropping this information, family, back in the early 80s. And I mean, he was dropping all this information about the pre-America, prior to Columbus, and how America, before Columbus, was already influenced by African. As far as a lot of the ruins and different stuff that they found inside of America, and this like the Olmecs, the big heads out in Mexico, the Olmec heads, all of this ties back into Africa, and this information was already on the scene before Columbus. But Dr. Ivan Van Settlement is one of our great scholars, family. You know, when you're talking about the scholars that was really bringing this information back in the early 80s, all the way up into the mid 90s, when you're talking about Dr. Ivan Ben Settlement, you're talking about Dr. Yusuf Ben Jockanen, you're talking about Dr. John Henry Clark, you're talking about Leonard Jeffries, you're talking about Dr. Francis Chris Reston, you're talking about oh man, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diab. It's so many our great scholars that was dropping this information back in the early 90s. And Bobby Hemmett said it was a black power movement was going on. It started in the early 80s and it went all the way up into the mid 90s. It was a serious black power movement. And this brother right here, Dr. Ivan Ben Settlement, he was right at the center of all this movement with all this information and everything.
Cortez came here in 1519 and he entered Mexico. And Mexico, when I speak of Mexico in this program, do not confuse it simply with the Mexico we know today. That was a center of a civilization that spread over a great part of this continent. That when Cortez entered, he had come out of the heart of Europe, and he said when he entered Native America, when he entered Mexico, and he saw the pyramids and the palaces and the floating gardens and the zoos and the aqueducts and the running baths, he says, I have not seen its like in Europe.
So the main idea in your book, you were dealing with that initially.
The main idea in my book is that there were visits to this continent from the old world, that there were visits to the Native Americans in this continent, and those visits included Africans. And two of the visits of Africans were major and significant, and they affected American civilization. And American civilization was far more complex, far more advanced than was formerly believed. Earth satellites a few months ago revealed that the Native Americans, long before the coming of Europeans, had the most intricate network of irrigation canals ever discovered in agriculture.
Okay, let us clear up one thing before we go any further. In the book that came before Columbus, you used the terms Negro Nubian, Negro Egyptian.
Also, family, he'll also explain this in part 2, but there is a current, water current in North Africa. If you put a boat in this water current, it would automatically bring you up into the Americas, the Gulf of Mexico. And this water current, once you put a boat or whatever you put in there, you don't need no motor, you don't need no paddles. Just put it in that boat in that water current, and it'll automatically bring you into the Americas and the Gulf of Mexico and so forth. And As he said, Columbus, he actually didn't discover America. He stumbled up on the Caribbean islands. He put his boat in this current and he stumbled up on the Caribbean islands. But a lot of people, in the history book, they said Columbus, he navigated his way over here and found America. And that was all. That wasn't totally true like that, family.
Why?
Well, that in some ways is unfortunate. I found it necessary to use the word Negro. I no longer use it. I'm now the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, and I use the word Africoid for African types, skulls, etc. The reason why I was forced to use the word I had been trained in European anthropology and archaeology. All the books I had read used this term, not necessarily with the social implications which it has here. They use this term to separate Africoid types of people from Caucasoids or Mongoloid types, Asiatic and European types. Also, it is a word that has entered neutrally, without any social significance, in the languages of many people who do not have the same kind of prejudices as people in the Anglo-American and some of the Western nations who became colonial powers. Like in some languages in Europe, they use the term Niger, simply meaning black, without any of those connotations. Furthermore, the problem lay in that the word black could not always be used, because if you spoke of a black god, it may not be an African. You can have a black god who is not an African. Tezcatlipoca, for example, is a Native American god who is black, but he's not African. But there is a god, Nawalpili, who is both black and African. He's not only black in a ritual or symbolic sense, but he has Africoid features. So that was the problem I faced, and I had to make those connections, because when people talked of Nubians, they didn't often realize they were talking about black people.
In the first few pages of They Came Before Columbus, you write about when Columbus himself heard about about Africans, the possibility of Africans having been here years before. What about that?
Yes, so Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this. He mentions that when he came back from his first voyage, he went to see the Portuguese. He didn't actually go there on purpose. A storm drew him into Lisbon, Portugal. He'd been sent out by the Spanish. The Portuguese invited him to the court, and there he learned from the Portuguese, who were moving across Africa, who had set up the first fort among Europeans in Africa, that African sailors had actually crossed over the Western Ocean and had found a land mass in the south. This was not what Columbus had found. Columbus found islands, which are now known as the Caribbean islands, but he had not gone on to a continental mass. The Africans had found the actual continental mass. And the Portuguese insisted that this continental mass in the south was 370 leagues, which is about 15 to 1600 miles away, according to whether you count a league as 4 or 4.5. There were differences in counting of a league, but it was about 1500 to 1600 miles away from Africa. And they pointed this out. And Columbus went back to Spain, and he insisted, because the Portuguese promised to help him, he insisted that they should draw a line across the world, and that this line should be drawn 370 leagues away from the Cape Verde Islands across Africa, and that Spain would claim lands he had found on the other side, and if Portuguese found land within that line on the other side, they could claim it. And Brazil, which was visited by the Africans, was on the other side of the line. And this line was drawn in 1494. It was drawn up in June 1494, before any Europeans had come to South America, on the basis of African knowledge.
Okay, let's get down to the crux of the matter. How did these Africans come to the New World?
Okay, now one of the things, as I have pointed out, in the metallurgy, like the steel, etc., in astronomy, etc., there is a profound misunderstanding of African capacity. The Africans had ships. This is one of them. This is in East Africa. This ship, this is just a model which I found in Fort Mombasa in Kenya. This ship is a 70-tonner. Ships like these in the 13th century before Columbus took elephants to China, right across the Indian Ocean. But this is just, they had ships like this in East Africa before Christ, but there were ships in North Africa along the Mediterranean that were far more sophisticated than any ships the Europeans had. European shipping is not even European. The sail Columbus used comes out of the Arab-African world. The astrolabe comes out of the Arab-African world. They found in the desert before Columbus, in the period before Columbus, the Africans were using compasses and nautical instruments to navigate.
But family, in part two, he's going to go into the current. He's going to go into the current of North Africa, and he's going to explain how these ships ended up in the Americas. Okay, I'm gonna pause, please.
Yes, I was speaking about the type of currents that take Africans into the New World. Now, I lived in South America. I was born in South America on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. And every year, in fact, I realized that when I was a boy of 10, that the many things would come in on the currents along the Atlantic. And some of the things that I found came from Africa. Scientists have found, botanists have found, for example, that the bottle gourd, which is African, can float by itself to America.
Bottle gourd? The
bottle gourd, yes. It's known in botany as Laginarius caesarea. Now, several things come out of Africa, not just men and ships. So that a man, once you enter that current, once you enter one of those currents, you automatically come to America. In fact, that is the way South America was rediscovered by Europeans. Alvarez Cabral, the Portuguese explorer, was going along Africa. Winds came up and blew his ships to South America. It is so close, really. So that this was a kind of journey that it could have been made thousands of years ago. There is no difficulty about the journey. The reason why people thought it was impossible is because it involved Africans. And since Africans were thought to be the lowest human being, nobody could think they had the capacities or the abilities. That is the reason why I am not only concerned with establishing this kind of contact and this kind of influence on American civilization, but showing what were the true potentials of Africans before the conquest. Now, not only do you have these currents, but you have evidence of boats. You have boats that take you. The Africans had been developing boats in the Niger. They'd been developing boats on the Mediterranean. Now, people have asked, why should they move out of the Mediterranean? But if you study the period in which these heads are found, in which the African presence is found for the first time in America, you will find there was a war on. Asia was moving down. You see this ship, for example, here. This ship was used before Christ.
When was this particular ship built?
This was built in 1969 by Africans who crossed from North Africa at the port of Safi, a North African port, and went right across the Atlantic, moving more than 2,000 miles until they reached the edge of Barbados. Now, this is something that scientists said was impossible. It would get waterlogged, it would sink. And they took the papyrus reed and they put it in a laboratory tank and it sank. And Heyerdahl said, nonsense. The Queen Mary is made of iron, and if I took a piece of the Queen Mary and put it in a laboratory tank, it would also sink.
So this ship is made of what now?
This is made of papyrus reed.
Oh, exactly what
it has that? No nails or anything. It's a long sort of fibrous kind of thing.
That comes from what?
It comes from papyrus.
Okay.
That is the thing in itself.
Okay.
It grows like that.
Okay, that's what I'm getting to.
And
okay.
After this, the Egyptians built many marvelous ships. They even affected Phoenician shipping. And the Phoenicians, who I spoke of the last time, many of them became black and mixed with blacks because they moved into the black world. They became friends of the blacks, etc. In fact, a Phoenician king was executed by the Syrians, who were Asiatics, because of his conspiracy with the black kings. Now, bear in mind, these terms are difficult to remember for some people, but it's important to see the picture of the period. That the Assyrians started to move down the Asiatics, who were led by the great power, the Assyrians, not to be confused with the modern Syrians. The Assyrians moved down and started to attack various people. They attacked the Jews. The blacks came and saved the Jews. It's recorded even in the Bible that 700 BC, Taharka, the Ethiopian king, it's mentioned in in a chapter and verse in Kings in the Bible, where the
And family, he just pointed out something. Tahaka in 671 BC, he had went into Judah, and he told the Assyrians, he gave the Assyrians 1 day to get the hell out of Judah, because the king of Judah at that time was king, I can't think his name. But anyway, he gave the Assyrians 1 day to get the hell out of there, because the Jews in Judah, they was having, I mean, they couldn't do nothing. The Assyrians was shaking them down. It was just like mafia. You know how the mafia move in on someone's turf, and they shake them down for everything if they planning on doing business in this particular section of the city or whatever. But anyway, when it came to Haka, he after he gave them 1 day to get the hell out of there, he came back the next day, and the ones that were still hanging around, he squashed them. He squashed them and ran them. They had to get their ass up out of there. And so that's what I'm saying that to say this. A lot of the Hebrew brothers don't have a lot of love for our African kings, but a lot of our African kings was on the side of our Hebrew brothers and our Jewish brothers. And so, this Tahaka was one of those kings. He was over the 40,000 men, Nubian soldiers. He was in charge of 40,000 black Nubian soldiers, and they went into Judah and they squashed the Assyrians. And so I just wanted to make that point. Dr. Ivan Seven just made that point. I just want to make that point also, that a lot of our African kings was they was our brothers also, and we should not be so hard on a lot of our African kings.
The Ethiopian king Taharka came and saved the Jews under Hezekiah when the Assyrian Sennacherib was attacking. And you have the blacks also saving not only the Jews, the blacks protected the Phoenicians, the blacks fought against the Syrians and pushed them and kept them at bay for a long time, until eventually the Assyrians invaded Egypt and pushed the blacks back in the south, and there was a north to south movement for quite a while, lots of battles going on. But because of this war, a lot of shipping traffic would push west down the Mediterranean towards the North Atlantic. And because the Phoenicians and blacks had something going called Carthadas, later to be called Carthage, in the North Atlantic, they began moving their ships down, getting metals which were so critical in the war. They were getting these things, copper and to make bronze, copper, and tin. And they have evidence of Phoenician ships in the North Atlantic as early as this period. So an accident could have occurred. The ships did not intend to come to America, but they were well equipped to go on other journeys in the North Atlantic. An accident occurred that drove them into mid-Atlantic, and then they moved along those currents into the Gulf of Mexico.
We have a lot of other areas to cover, but what are some of the other evidences of African contact with America that you draw from inferences?
Well, influences, the influence of Africans.
Inferences.
Yes.
Okay.
You have, for example, they have found an American cotton. I don't want to go into the complexities of it, but I have spent a whole chapter on that, where you show that American cotton, which has 26 chromosomes, 13 of the chromosomes are African, showing a marriage occurred between an American wild cotton and an African diploid cotton. Botany. Linguistic. They found many African words in the languages of some of the South American people and some of the Middle American people. Leo Weiner, a Harvard linguist in the 1920s, established that. Metallurgy. They found that they found that Native Americans in parts of the Caribbean were using African spears, metals which were forged by Africans, which were not in the Caribbean, which were never made by Native Americans. This was established by Columbus himself in Spain. The assayers showed that these were African spears. The mixture of alloys were African. In the area of engineering, they found certain, like for example in the Olmec period, they found the ritual orientation of certain buildings and the kind of architecture that was involved and the kind of techniques that were involved were identical. The use of the same heavy transport techniques, the same methods of moving the vast stones, the same method of quarrying, you found evidences like that. And what is most astonishing is that the very place where I'm talking about, where you find these heads and the skeletons and the clay portraits, they found an African script. Now that is the most astonishing thing, because most people do not even know that the Africans have several scripts. They know of the Egyptian, they know of the Meroitic, but they're not aware that Africa actually produced several scripts. The Mande script or Manding script, nothing to do with the later Mandingo, was found at La Venta.
Do you have an example of that here?
I don't have an example of that here, but I want to show you a more recent example, something which I myself found, which was translated by Harvard and by the Libyan Department of Antiquities in North Africa. Now look at this carefully.
Okay.
It's difficult to see the whole of it, but perhaps you can pan across it so that you could see the whole of it. Now this, note that there's an Arabic reading at the bottom. It runs right across a pool. Now you can actually go and see this. You can actually go to United States Virgin Islands, St. John, the Reef Bay Valley, and on a dry day, when the water does not cover it, you can look along the waterline and you will see those markings. Now, since 1888, about 100 years ago, anthropologists and archaeologists have been going to that spot, and they were looking above it at various markings which they could not understand. But when I got there, I noticed there were dots and crescents. You see those things at the edges? Right. Away from the sort of spiral figures on the head and so on. The little dots and crescents.
Right.
Now there are peculiar formations that are extremely regular. And I was given permission by the Virgin Islands government to, I put my finger in there for 2 days, got the exact sort of depressions, took away the incrustations and the moss, put chalk in them, and they were photographed. And then they were taken to Barry Fell at Harvard, and the Libyan Department of Antiquities established that this is the Tifinagh branch of a Libyan script, and that this was used before Columbus. Some of it was even used before Islam. It was used before.
Family, that particular writing that he's showing there, this was found in the Americas. This was found in the Gulf of Mexico, this same writing. And this same writing traced all the way back to Kemet, all the way back to Kemet, and even beyond Kemet, all the way into Africa, these same writings. And all of this information, family, was already, everything he's talking about here, it was already in place inside of Americas before Columbus. And all of this information has been hidden for so many years. And the school curriculums that we have today don't reflect this information. And it's sad because our children, be it black, white, Mexican, whoever the case may be, they're not getting the true education that they should be getting. And that's a tragedy. It really is.
Before Columbus, and it has been given a translation. It's right above a pool, and it has a specific translation
What
which
is
was
that
given.
translation?
It is plunging to cleanse and dissolve away impurity. This is water for ritual ablution before devotion.
You're saying that that's what that says?
That is what that says. And they have shown this script. It's not something you can deny. It's not something that you can confute, because they have shown the markings, these dot and crescent formations. They have established it to be a script in North Africa. It was used before Columbus. It was used by people in southern Libya. It was used by blacks in the Sudan. It was used by the Tamahak Berbers in Mali. It was used by a 13th century cliff-dwelling people in Mali. All of these various black and mixed peoples made use of that script. Okay. And so you have evidences like these.
What about mummification?
Well, mummification was found in South America. Now, that map which we showed you at the beginning, that map which has a sort of basin that leads down into South America, that shows you that in America, and we are very confused about the word America, because when we think of America, we think of a very little place, the United States. That's only about a quarter of the American continent. America is one continent. It's only at the beginning of the 19th century that they cut a little canal between the two Americas. You have connections between those two continents. They've found, for example, the Olmec culture I talk about links up with Chavin culture in South America. In South America, they have found Egyptian influences.
Where would the Olmec culture be today, the Olmec area?
That is the Gulf of Mexico. You can go to Levanta. All you will see there now is the pyramid. You'll see almost nothing else. All these heads have been carted away. They're in museums, Museum of Anthropology in Mexico. One of them is in Washington. They're all over the place. To come back to mummification,
right,
because one is so overwhelmed by the facts that one has gathered about this over the years. But mummification, they found very clear evidence of this in South America. The exact formula, which nobody else in the world knew or could repeat. The exact Egyptian formula. Professor Rueta found that the same substances in the same combination, the same formula was being used in South America to mummify some of their things. Now, this was not found so easily in Olmec, Mexico, because the area at Levanta is so swampy that the humidity is so corrosive that these things did not survive. But they found it in the sculptures. They found Egyptian-type sculptures with the shroud, with the type of headdress, with the arms crossing like this with the fingers open. They opened the fingers so that the dead could not grab onto their souls. This was a sort of myth or ritual, and you find this repeated in the Olmec world. Quite a number of rituals, in fact, that were Egyptian you find in the Olmec world. The double crown, rituals of the kings, the use of purple as an index of royalty.
In the book you talk about a finding by the University of Oklahoma, I think it is. What about that?
Yes, in 1963, the University of Oklahoma discovered that one of the Egyptian mummies, Princess Mini, was so well preserved that you could take some of the cells, thousands of years after, you could take some of the cells and transplant it in a body, and it would still be able to be operative. That is, it is almost as if you had, like in the sorts of things they do today where they take out kidneys, etc. Some of the cells were so well preserved. It's almost as if they had lived in a block of ice, as it were, that they could be transplanted into a body.
What about the influence of the African calendar on the New World calendar?
Well, that is very complex, because the New World had several calendars, and the Egyptians had several calendars, but one of them contained identical symbols and also a body of things that indicated that it was Egyptian. I don't remember the details because it's some years since I wrote the book, but the calendars are complex because you have so many types of calendars, but one of them, as Abbé Hervas has established, one of them was identical with the Egyptian and indicated an influence.
You talked earlier about...
So family, all of this information that he's dropping, all this information that he's dropping, it need to be put into the school curriculum, family. The early influence of Africa, and in the Americas, in the South America, North America, and all of this information that he's dropping about the before Columbus era. You know, this information was already in the Americas, and I know now there's a group of people that's these governors and so forth. They don't want this information to be known. They call it critical race theory, and they said it promotes hate, but it don't promote hate. This is true history. It's going to benefit all of our children, not just not just the melanated community, but the phenomelanin community, the native community. It's gonna benefit everybody, because you're getting a true understanding, and you never know, once this true history is dropped, you may start seeing a better love and consideration for one another. Once everybody know who contribute what in the Americas. But like I say, you have a group of educators and governors that don't want this information to be known. But it's time. It is time for this information to be known. It's time for this information to be put in the history book. But other than that, family, I just wanted to drop that information, and that's all I have to say on that today. Peace. Hotel. Have a good one.